For nearly 10 years, I believed my marriage to Ethan was the safest part of my life, the one place where I never needed to question what I was being told, until a strange charge on our bank statement and a forgotten key inside his desk drawer made me realize that the man I trusted most had built an entire second life behind my back. My name is Natalie. I was 36, and I lived with Ethan in a quiet neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon, where I worked as an elementary school librarian while he managed regional accounts for a construction supply company and often traveled between Oregon and Washington. At first, nothing about Ethan's behavior looked dramatic enough to justify suspicion, because his explanations were always ordinary. His clothes came home clean, and he still remembered the little things like buying my favorite tea or asking whether I had fed our elderly golden retriever, Murphy. Then, one Thursday afternoon, while I was paying household bills, I noticed 3 expensive restaurant charges on our joint account from a town where Ethan had supposedly never stayed. And when I asked him about them that evening, he smiled and said they were business dinners that had been mistakenly charged to the wrong card. I wanted to believe him, especially because the alternative meant questioning years of memories. But 2 weeks later, Ethan announced that he had to attend an emergency supplier meeting in Spokane for 6 days, and insisted the trip had been arranged at the last minute. The night before he left, I found a small brass key tucked inside the lining of an old briefcase, and when I asked what it opened, he hesitated for half a second before saying it belonged to a storage unit he had forgotten about, a detail so strangely specific that I knew I would remember it. Instead of confronting him, I waited until he left and searched through the household paperwork, where I discovered that Ethan had been paying for a storage unit across town for almost 18 months without ever mentioning it to me. The following morning, I drove there with the key in my pocket, expecting boxes of old business records. But behind a stack of Christmas decorations, I found a suitcase containing women's clothing, framed photographs, restaurant reservations, and several birthday cards addressed to someone named Marissa. My hands started shaking when I opened the photographs because Ethan wasn't standing beside a random colleague or a distant relative. He was smiling beside Marissa in places I recognized from the stories he'd told me about his supposed business trips, including a lakeside hotel where he claimed he'd spent one miserable night during a conference. There were pictures of dinners, weekend hikes, and even a photograph of Ethan holding a small bouquet beneath a handwritten sign that said, "Our little tradition," and suddenly 18 months of suspicious travel had become something far more painful than a few unexplained charges. I almost called Ethan immediately, but anger would have given him an opportunity to erase whatever remained. So I photographed every document, wrote down every date, and contacted the storage facility only to confirm that the unit was legally connected to his name. Then I noticed something that changed my entire plan. Tucked inside one of the boxes was an unopened envelope from a property management company, and the address on it belonged to a small furnished apartment only 40 minutes from our house. When Ethan returned from Spokane 6 days later, he walked through the front door carrying flowers and complaining about airport delays, completely unaware that I had spent the afternoon sitting across from a private investigator who had helped me understand what I was looking at without invading anyone's accounts or doing anything illegal. I didn't accuse Ethan, threaten him, or mention Marissa. Instead, while we ate dinner, I casually told him that I had received an interesting phone call that afternoon from someone asking about the apartment he had been renting. The fork in Ethan's hand stopped halfway to his mouth, and although he recovered quickly, that tiny pause told me more than a dramatic confession ever could because I hadn't mentioned an address, a name, or even the word, affair. He stared at me for several seconds before asking, far too carefully, "What exactly did they say?" And I simply replied, "That's the strange part, Ethan, because I haven't told you what they asked about yet." Left the table and walked into the hallway, claiming he needed some air, but instead of following him, I remained seated and watched him call someone whose name I couldn't hear, speaking in a low voice about the storage unit and asking whether everything was still there. When he returned, his face had changed completely. And for the first time in our marriage, I saw him understand that whatever story he had prepared for me was no longer enough. That night, Ethan finally admitted that Marissa wasn't a colleague, but someone he'd been secretly seeing for more than a year, and the apartment wasn't simply a place he rented for convenience, because he had been using it as a second home whenever he told me he was traveling for work. He claimed the relationship had started after a difficult period in our marriage and insisted he had never intended to leave me. But hearing those words only made the betrayal feel colder, because he wasn't apologizing for what he'd done so much as explaining why he believed he could keep doing it. The next morning, I gave Ethan one final envelope containing copies of the evidence I'd collected and told him that I wasn't interested in another explanation, another promise, or another carefully rehearsed apology, because trust isn't destroyed by one mistake, but by hundreds of decisions made in secret. I filed for divorce several weeks later, kept Murphy, moved into a smaller house closer to my parents, and slowly rebuilt a life where I no longer had to wonder whether a business trip was actually a business trip, while Ethan was finally forced to live with the consequences of the choices he had spent 18 months hiding. Looking back, I don't think the brass key was what exposed Ethan, and neither were the restaurant bills, photographs, or apartment records, because those things only gave me pieces of a puzzle that he had already created himself. The real truth appeared when I gave him one harmless question he wasn't prepared for, because an innocent person usually asks for clarification, while someone protecting a secret immediately starts wondering how much you already know. And that was the moment I stopped doubting myself and started believing what my instincts had been telling me all along. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.